As we continue my last week here on Locked On Lightning, we're going to take a look back at the season that was and just take a look at some points of different months of the year that kind of shaped the Lightning season and could have an impact on the future of the franchise. We'll start with 2024 on today's episode of Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into another episode of Locked On Lightning. I'm Josh Sperber, thanking all of you for making Locked On Lightning your first listen every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if your team is the Tampa Bay Lightning, then this is the show for you. And as I mentioned, we're going to take a look back at kind of the how the year was for the Tampa Bay Lightning, just doing a little bit of a deep dive on the 2024-25 season. Obviously, we know how it ended, and there are some things that we didn't like, some things we did like about this season, but we're just going to kind of go through it over the course of this week, starting with the first month of 2024, which obviously I think was marred a little bit by the hurricanes. That we don't need to relive, of course, but that definitely gave the Lightning a motivation to start the season off on a really good foot. And October ended up being one of the strongest months of the season overall for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Aside from the two preseason games, the Lightning lost 3 games in the month of October, only one of them at home. The Lightning finished the first month of the season with 4 wins at home, 1 of them in overtime, and 1 loss at home, and an even 2-2 record on the road. And it was really the road performances that I think were most concerning at the start of the year for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and something that really did kind of set the tone for at least the regular season in Tampa Bay, because there were a lot of disappointing things about that first playoff series for Tampa Bay. But I think one of the most the most disappointing ones was that that the Lightning lost the series at home. The Panthers got to celebrate clinching a spot in the next round of the playoffs and clinching the series in Tampa Bay. That really stung. And then the Lightning played 3 playoff games against the Panthers at home after they finished one of the season. The season is one of the best home teams in the entire NHL. And they couldn't win any of their 3 playoff games at home. They did win one on the road, the 3rd game of the series, during Hagel's suspension even. And that was it was something else that just wasn't indicative of the Lightning season, and shows that there was some kind of disconnect, it felt like, between how the Lightning started and how they played most of the regular season than with the way that they played in the playoffs. But something that became very clear from the beginning for the Tampa Bay Lightning was the fact that they were kind of starting the season by testing out really what they had, and before they really committed to some of their newer players. Connor Geekie earned his way towards the opening day roster for Tampa Bay. And I think that was very clear that he was, he wasn't just some regular rookie who needed some time. He was a guy that really had earned a spot on an NHL roster. I think there still definitely was some development needed with Connor Geekie, and that I think definitely took place by the time he got to the AHL. But also really over the course of the start of the season, he just looked like he was going to be a solid contributor. And They had also made their first call up from the AHL, unless you counted Gary. Well, you can't really count Geeky with that, but their first AHL call up was Connor Sheary, who played 3 rather underwhelming games with the Tampa Bay Lightning in the month of October, one more than he played after the month of October in the NHL. And Connor ended up having a great season with the Syracuse Crunch. He was their team leader in points, tied for their team league in goals, and their team leader in assists as well. He has played a pretty long career in the NHL. He's been in just under 600 NHL games over the course of his career, but at least with the Tampa Bay Lightning, the month of October kind of solidified that Sheary's career with the Tampa Bay Lightning has more or less come to an end. He played 57 games with the teams last season. They still have him under team control for another year, but it's difficult to see a path for me to Connor Sheary coming back towards the Lightning with some of the young players that they have. And I think it really was later in the season that some of these younger guys really started to emerge for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But at the beginning of the season, the Lightning did as they did, as most other teams in the NHL would do, and they just kind of worked with their opening day roster. They brought up an NHL vet for a couple of games, and you look at some of the games that Connor Sheary played for the Tampa Bay Lightning. His first game was a win at home against Vancouver, a really gutsy win. Then he played 2 games on the road, one of them just an absolute goal fest against the Devils, and a 5-4 loss against the Senators, which for me was one of the more disappointing games of the month. I think it really kind of set up that loss against the Leafs in a way, because it just shook the Lightning confidence, dropping a game that you just know that Lightning team really felt that they should have won. This was, I think, before the Senators, because they were a team that made a really late run in the season. This was one of the, I think, turning points in Ottawa's season that really showed some other teams that, okay, they might not just be a bottom feeder anymore, but this was a game that the Lightning just got out to an early deficit. They fought back, but they couldn't quite take the lead. And this was the first of one of those kind of games for Tampa Bay. And this was a pretty persisting theme throughout the entire season. You look at most of the Tampa Bay Lightning losses, including all of them in the month of October, the team that scored the first goal would usually end up being the victor against the Tampa Bay Lightning over the course of the season. In the preseason, obviously, things are a little bit different. But in the preseason overtime loss to Florida, it was the Panthers who scored the first goal. In the preseason overtime loss to Carolina, it was the Hurricanes who scored the first goal. So in every game that the Lightning lost, they surrendered the first goal. And it was not something that in the course of the first month or even the rest of the season that Tampa Bay was really able to get over. A lot of times they were just a team that played a lot better when they played with the lead. And that just, it made it more difficult that when the Lightning inevitably lost leads later in the season, because there's no team that is just only going to trail in their losses. There's always some comebacks involved in an NHL season. But it just wasn't, it wasn't a perfect start for sure for Tampa Bay. But, I think the losses that they had were all pretty difficult losses to take. And they kind of set the tone for a lot of the ways that the Lightning would win games, and unfortunately, some of the ways that Tampa would lose games. They had some big games against some really good teams. They showed flashes that they weren't going to be the team that kind of falls out of the postseason that everyone a lot of people really thought that they would be. They thought there'd be a bigger drop-off with Steven Stamkos gone, and his return to Amalie Arena went about as perfectly as you can make it. Stamkos had a really nice game. To that point, it was probably his best game of the season. It was his first 2 assists of the year, second and third points. He had not had a great start with the struggling Predators, but he had assists on both of Nashville's goals, and the Lightning took the win in overtime. A really exciting game, and I think the Lightning really needed that as a team because it helped silence a lot of the doubters, not just about the Lightning's decision letting one of their franchise players go, one of their all-time great players go, but that this could be a team that is on the rise in the NHL season. Unfortunately, that didn't always stay consistent with the way the Lightning played. They took a bit of a step back in the second month of the season. So we'll talk about November in the 11th minute of the show over the 11th month of the season. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no shells variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days, whether I'm snacking at my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost. They're always my go-to. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So the first month of the season, the Lightning came out looking like one of the leaders of the Atlantic Division, defying a whole lot of expectations at the start of the season. And things kind of took a turn for the worse, at least at the beginning of November. I think the things kind of balanced out at the end of the month. For the most part, the Lightning took games that they should have won, but especially at the beginning of the month, they just kind of ran into a gauntlet of 2 really tough teams. And then that, I think, kind of hurt their motivation a bit for Tampa Bay. One thing that November did see was kind of the launch of Gage Gonzalez. It was his first foray into consistent action in 2025. And he was, I think, a defining player in the Lightning season in terms of just showcasing his promise and his ability to set up the Lightning for future success. I mean, he by no means was ever a player on that Lightning team that just looked like a rookie, looked like a guy that was just, trying to figure things out. The only thing was that this was just Gonzalez's time to really prove himself. And it just began to a season full of Gage Gonzalez having some success on the ice that continued to improve over the course of the season. And for me, became one of the most impressive players on the Lightning roster, just in terms of his progression and his development in both the AHL and the NHL over the course of the 2024 and 25 season. Gonzalez, you can speak to his accomplishments in the NHL season with Tampa Bay. He finished second on the team in points over the course of the postseason, and in 60 games had 8 goals and 12 assists and 20 total points. Not bad for a guy who'd only played 2 prior games in the NHL and a couple of seasons in the minors. But in his short stint in the AHL, he looked really strong as well. 18 points in 14 games for the Syracuse Crunch. A second-round pick in 2020, who's still on the young side, is Gonzalez, 24 years old, which he turned on January 16th. But, he showed that he belonged, I think, with Tampa Bay in the month of November. And I'm not saying this because I think that had Julien Brisebois and the Lightning not sent him up and down from Syracuse, much would have changed in the Lightning season. I think whatever they did with Gage Gonzalez has turned him into a player who is ready for a breakout season. I think no matter what goes on with the free agency and everything like that, I think regardless of anything but an injury to Gonzalez, he's someone that I think can make a huge rise in his second season, his first full season as a pro. But he still played the majority of this year, 60 of 82 games for Gonzalez. And by playoff time, he was one of the key contributors, one of the guys who was just an everyday starter for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And he really impressed me the most over the course of that Lightning season. But the Lightning did show a lot of resilience in the month of November after a difficult start. They ran into a wall adorned by two of the hottest teams in the NHL at the start of the season. The Winnipeg Jets might have had just one loss at that point, and Kirill Kaprizov and the Wild were looking like the breakout team of 2024. And just having those two tough losses that at some points both seemed winnable. The Jets at that point had won 11 of their first 12, but the Lightning had the first two goals in that game. They had it was tied 3-3 going into the third period, 4-4 after the first couple minutes of the third period. And then the Jets just kind of ran away with it. In that game against the Wild, the Lightning scored the first goal and then never led after that. So those were two games that you really felt like the Lightning could win against two of the toughest teams in the league that just kind of slipped away. And I think that ended up being a little bit of foreshadowing, because you look at that series against the Panthers. Yeah, the Lightning were banged up. The Panthers have continued on a admittedly really great run over the course of the postseason. But, the Lightning, you still felt like going into that series with how evenly the teams were matched. It seemed like you had some of the top players starting to click at the right time. It just felt like they could have won that series. And I know I expected a better performance from the Lightning. I don't think too many people listening to this are going to disagree with that. And I think those were the first kind of indications that, all right, this is a team that I think needs to do a better job of holding leads and winning some of these close games. And that ended up biting them later in the month after a gift of a goal from Charlie Lindgren and the Washington Capitals. And even against the Stars, after the Lightning had that 3-game win streak, an overtime win, demolishing the Jets and the Devils, who at that point had the two best records in the NHL. In back-to-back games at home, 8-1, the combined score with just a day of rest in between, following that up with an overtime loss. Then they go and lose an absolute goal fest to the Columbus Blue Jackets, which I think kind of sparked something in Columbus, but I think everyone knows the reasoning behind, the motivation behind the Blue Jackets' successful season. But, just over the course of this month, it was just defined by games that the Lightning could have had, but they didn't. They were leading for most of the game against one of the bottom feeders in the NHL in the Philadelphia Flyers. They lost that one in a shootout and a late third period goal. They had a game against the Maple Leafs at home where they had just a furious comeback late in the third period, but they were already down 4 goals. So just too little too late there. And I think the month of November really served as somewhat of a metaphor for the entire Lightning season, that it was just a lot of coulda, woulda, shoulda, definitely some good things that you could see from some of the Lightning players. Brandon Hagel really started to take his star turn. And the Four Nations roster started to take shape, adding a lot of those Lightning players later in that year as well. And, Cirelli started to look like one of the best, if not the best, two-way forward in the game. Things are really starting to move forward in a lot of ways for a lot of individual Lightning players. JJ Moser as well, who looked like he was really starting to click with the defense in Tampa Bay, and especially towards the end of the month and in the beginning of December, which we'll get into in our next segment. Things really started to look up in a lot of ways, but it was just kind of piece by piece. And a lot of times the Lightning just couldn't put the whole puzzle together. And that, I think, is a pretty apt description of how the Lightning season, not just the month of November in 2024, but how the whole season of 2024-25 ended up for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And when we conclude this episode, we'll have concluded a look back at the Lightning's 2024 part of the 2024 and 25 season. Now, the Lightning had a great start to the month of December, and they lost only 3 games in that month, 2 of them to teams that are still playing in the NHL postseason. Edmonton Oilers, their first loss of December, and then the one that we're going to talk about the most in the loss to the Florida Panthers, because that had to be one of the most heartbreaking losses of the entire season. The Lightning were so good at home. They had not lost a single home game in the month of December. And at that point, the Blue Jackets and the Blues were, solid. The game against the Sharks was a game against a team that was, towards the bottom of the league, had a really exciting star. Macklin Celebrini, Will Smith was starting to emerge, and the Lightning blew them out of the water. They beat another, at that point, playoff contending team before a lot of the Canucks drama really kicked into high gear. And the Flames and the Kraken, who were both kind of on the outside looking in, had a tough loss against the Edmonton Oilers, another one that, seemed winnable. It was tied halfway through the second period, tied going into close to the end of it, but right after that Jake Gensel goal, it was an own goal that Leon Draisaitl ended up getting credit for. And just a tough way to lose that game. But that seemed kind of washed away at the point that the Lightning had a home and home against the Panthers on the 22nd and 23rd. And the Lightning made up in some parts for that loss against Florida in Sunrise, taking the entire home and home on goal differential, technically 8-2, but that 4-2 loss at home stung. And it was just one of those games that just kind of seemed like the rest of the postseason, where the Lightning were kind of chasing the tails of the Florida Panthers the entire time, even for the couple brief moments that it got tied. There was a little bit more than half of the first period. It was 0-0. Power play goal for the Panthers. Nick Paul tied it very close to the end of the first period. You think that would have given the Lightning a whole lot more momentum. It did not. The Panthers put up 2 more in the second period, and the Lightning were chasing really the rest of the way. They never led against Florida. And for that to happen, not just against your rival team, but after a 4-game win streak and a stretch of December, right after a really difficult kind of seesaw month of November that the Lightning had, the Lightning heading into that game had won 4 straight and 6 out of their last 7 against a couple of teams that were in the divisional race at that point in the season. So you really felt like the Lightning came into their first game against the Panthers in the right mode. And it seemed like, because J.J. Moser's loss to injury was an unfortunate but defining moment of the month of December. He had an assist and played most of the game against Calgary and then didn't get another minute of NHL action for another 2.5 months. And that really stung, because as John Cooper said after that game, he was really starting to, round into form and start to really understand how to fit with the Tampa Bay Lightning defense and understand his role with his new team and his expanded role on a team that's playing for a lot more than the Coyotes did when J.J. Moser was playing out west. But then after that game, the Lightning won 3 straight, a convincing win on the road and 2 pretty convincing wins at home. And, I know the Jackets, the Blues, and the Kraken, well, the Blues made the playoffs. The Kraken and Jackets did not, but these were all games that the Lightning just kind of either battled back from or completely controlled from the beginning. The Blue Jackets game, it was clear the Lightning just kind of took their foot off the gas pedal a little bit late in the game. It was 4-0 going into the third. The Lightning won 5-3. Then against the Blues, it was securely in the Lightning's hands the entire game. Plus, Gage Gonzalez ended up with his first ever goal about a minute after St. Louis put themselves within 1. Having a young guy like that put the icing on the cake in what at that point was still within his 10th NHL game, I believe, was huge. Then that all started with a 5-1 win after the 8-3 win on the road against Calgary. So it seemed like the Lightning had adjusted really well already without J.J. Moser and could just take that momentum into Sunrise to get a key win against the Florida Panthers, who at that point were making their way towards the top of the Atlantic Division, a point on the division mountain in the regular season that they ended up losing. But, it was a battle of 2 teams who were kind of on fire at a key point of the season. And 2 shorthanded goals in the second period ended up being the difference. And it's another game that you might not have felt was winnable while you're watching it, but I think was preventable. You can't let, especially a team like the Panthers, get those shorthanded goals. I mean, that's just how they operate. They get those kind of pesky goals, get under your skin, and it hurts. And it was just I think a really gut check for Tampa Bay. And then even after they had 2 big wins against the Panthers and then a really convincing one against the Rangers, kind of solidifying the skid that New York was on. And it was one of those kind of enough is enough games as well, because Kucherov scored early in the game, Panarin tied it, and then McDonough's shorthanded goal led to an almost invincible second period for Tampa Bay that pretty much put that one to bed. And then they go and lose a game to the Canadiens that felt really preventable. It just, what the Lightning just didn't seem to have it for that one on the other end of the back-to-back. And I think it showed that the month of December really showed was more of a could be for the Tampa Bay Lightning when you compare it to when you kind of see how the season ends right now. It definitely helped give Gage Gonzalez some confidence, kind of showed that there still might be some more development needed for Connor Geekie, because the first 2 months of the NHL season, he looked great. Then in the month of December, playing nearly every game for Tampa Bay, he had 2 points and it didn't seem to be as much of a factor, was playing a lot more time on that fourth line and was just kind of working his way up and down the Lightning ladder and not getting consistent minutes. So I think it showed that Geekie needed some more development in the NHL, which he later got about a month or so later. And that Gage Gonzalez just kind of put himself back on the map after a pretty quiet, portion of November and December. he showed that he could still be a legit contributor for Tampa Bay. And I think overall in 2024, like, really the rest of the Lightning season, there were certainly some good things to look at. But some of the bad things just kind of dragged the team down a little bit too far. And in a lot of cases, especially when it came to their performance in close games and sometimes taking their foot off the gas at inopportune times, it definitely foretold what was to come in the playoffs and maybe even the rest of the season for Tampa Bay. And we're going to continue looking back at the Lightning season for the rest of the week. We'll start 2025 tomorrow. But until then, I just want to thank you once again for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Lightning and making us your first listen every day. Now, for your second listen, make sure to check out the all-new Locked On NHL Game Night. Every game, every night, until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And wherever you found today's episode of Locked On Lightning, I thank you. Really appreciate you guys tuning in, and please give us a like, subscribe, and a follow. We do appreciate you guys watching and supporting on social media and in the comments section. We really do appreciate the people who watch this show. So thank you again, and we'll see you tomorrow as we keep taking a look back at the season that was.